So what is brand storytelling? Well, the benefit of the phrase or the term brand storytelling is that the meaning is in the two words. It is telling the story of your brand. But what exactly does that mean, and why is that important? And essentially what you're doing is you're leveraging storytelling. You're leveraging the power of the messaging strategy of telling stories to increase your brand value and ultimately to create a stronger connection between your organization's brand and your target audience, right? And so that's ultimately what brand storytelling is. It's the continuous act of telling your brand story and thinking about marketing from the position of investing in value through the effect of compounding, rather than marketing simply being just a checklist, just something where you're just hitting your checkbox and you're getting your message out there so you can move on to the next thing. And you're not really thinking deeply about value creation. You're thinking about, I have to bring in sales for my company. So it's almost like it tends to be, and it tends to look like a thoughtless, fear-based, reactive approach to putting your organization's message out there, as opposed to thinking long-term, which is considering your brand value and your brand equity and investing and adding value into your brand over time. So that's ultimately what brand storytelling is. So in order to really start to unpack the complexity of what brand storytelling is, to start thinking about, well, how do we do it and how do we know if we're doing it? And let's make sure that we're not just mindlessly marketing and checking it off as a checkbox, right? So let's just take that word, the term brand storytelling. We'll just attack both of those. We'll just unpack both of those terms, like brand and storytelling. We'll start with the easy one first, which is storytelling. You know, what is a story? So I made a video about this. If you're interested, you could check it out here. But a story ultimately is the chronicle of a character who wants something and overcomes a series of obstacles in order to get what they want, right? It is a framework of communicating an experience, so that way you're teaching a lesson through the communication of that experience. Jordan Peterson has this really fantastic model of meaning creation, and it really fits in well when you think about how stories are created. Basically, as you go through life, right, you experience three different events as you go through your life. So there's a person, right, and we are actively working towards a goal. And as we're actively working towards that goal, we're going to inevitably encounter three different types of situations or three different types of events as we're actively working towards that goal. Those events would be events that, like problems, events that inhibit our progress of reaching our goal, neutral events, things that have no significance and really no impact on our ability to get towards our goal, and positive events, things that add value to our journey and in a sense tend to distract us, but they also there's a lot of emotional sort of like expenditure in these positive thrills that we're experiencing as we're getting to our goal. When we actually tell stories to somebody, when somebody asks us to tell them something, we learn very quickly that if we tell the story and we start putting in all of the neutral events into that story, no one cares because it's really boring, right? Because these have no impact on our progress towards the goal, right? Like if I were to tell you about how I woke up this morning and that, I walked downstairs, I poured myself a cup of coffee. I sat on the chair and just thought and journaled, and then I went upstairs and I used the bathroom, and then I went back downstairs and grabbed another cup of coffee. That's boring because you're chronicling just events, right? It's event, 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 and that's boring. That doesn't hold attention when you tell somebody that, right? So that's not a story, and we know that's not a story because as you're hearing that list of events, you're waiting for something. You're waiting for the twist. You're waiting for the turn. You're waiting for a problem to crop up, and you're waiting to hear about how I overcame that problem. That is what a story is. It is a depiction of our struggle and how we overcame the struggle. Now, on the flip side of that, thinking about telling about positive things, we actually hate listening to stories from people where it's just all positive stuff. So I was taking a group, and we were going over this. It was like a small like entrepreneur group, right? And we were reviewing this Praxis material. So this material from this organization called Praxis. So I really don't mean to throw Praxis under the bus, but this is just the best example that I could come up with. One of the sessions that they had, this woman showed up, and she just started telling her story, her entrepreneurial journey to how she got to where she was. And the entire journey was about positive thing after positive thing after positive thing after positive thing that happened to her, to the point where it literally demoralized all of us watching, because it was such an unrealistic account of someone's journey of getting something. It literally sounded like she was just handed a silver spoon at every twist and turn. And because of that, there's nothing that we could have learned from that. We didn't gain anything from that experience because we didn't learn like, hey, this went wrong and I encountered this problem. And because I encountered this problem, I changed my approach in this way. And therefore, this is the lesson I learned. And I then achieved this. So if you apply that same pattern to your own journey, you can get to where I am at, right? That's the benefit of listening to problems, is that you can learn from problems. There's no benefit of listening to just positive things happening. When we hear someone going through problems, we empathize with them. Our heart reaches out to them, and we want to see them succeed. And so when we do hear about the positive things, it's not that we're all just sitting around. We want miserable things to happen to people. Now, there are people out there, just miserable people that just want miserable things to happen to everyone else because it makes their misery feel, it normalizes their misery, right? And then they can be happy in their misery, right? I mean, it's upsetting, but like, hopefully you're not like that, right? But the majority of us, we want good things to happen to people. In a sense, we want good things to happen to people who deserve good things to happen to them. And that means that the deserving comes through the struggle. So we don't want to hear a story that recounts just neutral stuff, because that's boring and we bounce immediately. We don't want to listen to that person. They're wasting our time. We don't want to hear just someone talking about positive things, because that's offensive. And that's just someone bragging, and they're adding zero value to that engagement because we're not learning anything. Where learning and attention happen is in talking about the struggle and talking about overcoming struggles and overcoming obstacles. So that is why when we tell stories, we use the framework of a character who wants something. They're driven by a desire, who has to endure a series of obstacles, because it's not guaranteed whether or not they're going to overcome them, in order to get what they want. Because even if they're enduring those series of obstacles in a tragedy, they still don't necessarily get what they want. Like Romeo and Juliet, they didn't get what they want. They didn't sign up to kill themselves, right? Like that just tended to happen as throughout their narrative that they were going through, right? So stories are fundamentally the basis of how we communicate our human experience. And I believe they're the foundational code of humanity, right? Like you yourself, you have an identity, and that identity is based upon what we call a personal narrative. There's a story you tell yourself over and over and over again that reinforces who you are. Stories are how we put information together, and it's how we communicate that information to each other. There's also, within that personal identity, is our own worldview and our own cultural worldview, and those themselves are cultural narratives. They're world narratives that we have built. We use this in our language when we talk about video games, or when we talk about cinematic universes, right? Like we call the type of content creation around that world building, right? So their stories, in essence, are the glue that ties society together. It's the glue that ties your personhood together. And it is how we relate to one another, how we engage with one another, and how we form relationships with one another. So that's what a story is. And it's the act of telling that story over time through your marketing materials. And this is both through your branding, your direct response marketing materials, and your content marketing materials. That is what we mean when we talk about storytelling. It's not just telling a single story, it's the act of continuous storytelling. Now it's like, well, what's a brand? Okay, and what story are you telling? So a brand ultimately is the impression that you feel when you think about a company. Six Flags, Disney World. Disney World has weight. It has meaning. And that weight and that meaning that you can feel when you hear that word, that is its brand value. That is its brand equity. And it is literally something that we can experience. Brand is an emotional experience. It is an impression that you have. You literally feel the weight of the brand when you're encountering the brand. And that brand weight and that brand value is a culmination of everything within that organization. So everything within that organization is in itself branding, right? So you think about the brand as the personality of a corporation, just how my personality, right? Like it's difficult for me to communicate in words what my personality is, right? But after you experience, or after you engage with me or engage with our content long enough, you start to get an impression of what I'm like. You start to realize that I'm very matter of fact, I'm very direct, but I'm also a little bit of esoteric, and I'm a bit of heady, right? I'm kind of like up in the clouds, but I'm not so up in the clouds because I keep pointing everything back to practical reality, right? I'm emotional, but I think about emotions in a very realistic way, and I'm kind of energetic, right? I mean, I'll just keep going on and on. It's like, you get what I'm getting at. Like, that isn't dictated simply by my name, right? My name, Bryce, does not communicate my brand, just in the same way as a company's name does not communicate its brand. It is after engaging with that organization and an understanding of who that organization is, that then the company's name communicates that impression because it holds that impression, right? So when we say companies like Apple, right? Nike, like these big companies, you can feel the brand, and that's what a brand is. It's that impression. And like I said, it's the culmination of everything. It's not just the visual marketing materials that you're doing. Brand is very closely tied with the company culture, and it's the expression of that organization's values. So let me just kind of like walk through. The brand ultimately is the value that organization is providing, either through the impact it's making if it's a nonprofit, or the value that it's creating to its customer base in the marketplace, right? And that would be directly through your products and service. That's the initial value that it's creating. It's also being developed through the delivery mechanism through that product and service. So like the user experience, right? That is adding to the brand value. That's also being driven by how your customers or your audience are engaging with the employees of that organization, how they're being treated, and how the employees treat your customers is dictated by the values of your organization. Are these actual values? Is it an actual culture that they are living out? And then it's also reinforced by the visual branding of the organization and the company, and then how the marketing department is then leveraging that visual style and theming across all the marketing materials to reinforce and build this value. Okay? That is branding. All right? So you can see why people start to try to pit branding versus marketing. as if they're two opposite different kind of like ideologies, right? Or they're they don't even think about them as opposite different ideologies. So think of them as opposite different approaches. And it's almost like they communicate that as if you should abandon marketing in favor of branding because that's the easy way. That's just like, we're just going to make a bunch of pretty stuff. And because we're making pretty stuff, we don't actually have to grow our organization and grow our business. That's going to happen naturally. Okay. No. Because great branding still leverages marketing deployment tactics. And what you have to understand is that branding is just a sort of like seed inside of the ultimate marketing soil. That marketing isn't just a tactic. Marketing is an entire strategy that helps to dictate what is this brand going to be, who is our target audience, what do they need to hear from this organization, how are we going to provide value to them, how are we going to deliver that value to them, how are we going to price this value for them, and how are we going to form such a strong bond with them that they continue to come back over and over and over. That's all your marketing strategy, and it's almost as if your like branding is being strategic about your visual creative, so that way you're reinforcing. And you're being strategic not just about your visual creative, but in how all the decisions you're making within your company. So that way you're reinforcing this sentimental, emotional exchange and relationship between you and your ultimate audience and your ultimate customer. So there's two levels of stories that I believe are being told through brand storytelling. There's the macro story, and then there are micro stories. So the macro story is ultimately your brand narrative, right? And your brand narrative is kind of like, it can be told in two different ways, right? It's what other people say about you in the marketplace, and then it is also your own personal origin story. It's your story of purpose, right? So think about a company like a person. Okay. And so when you meet a person, you're usually, as you're being introduced to that person, you hear a story about that person that is told to you from other people. So that is the sort of like marketplace story that's being told. So again, if you think about Donald Miller's story brand framework, he's basically showing you he's giving you a template on how to shape your brand story. So that way you are kind of like embracing the fact that people are already telling a story about your company, and you can go ahead and just get right in line with that. So you're speaking very similar language that they are. Okay. Like it's an entire framework to help you understand how to see your company from the perspective of your customer, right? Highly recommend that you read Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. I love that book. It basically changed my life. So that's just one part, because the part where I feel like that book kind of like falls short on is not thinking about marketing in terms of it being a literal relationship between a company and other people, right? And it becomes almost like a one-to-one relationship. So I like to think about marketing from an interpersonal relationship, and I like to apply the same codes that we apply within our own interpersonal relationships to a marketing context. And so as you're beginning to build an affinity and build an affection for someone, you don't just want to hear their marketplace story. Eventually, you want to hear their story from their own mouth. And that is a sign that they are trusting you, that they're bringing you into their inner circle, and that you are actually now growing in the strength of the relationship between you and them. And that's when someone gets vulnerable and they actually share their origin story with you. It's like, so how did you get to where you are now, right? And there's usual tiers of that story. You'll get the SparkNotes version the first time, but then you can continue to dig and dig and dig and dig to where you really get into the emotional depth of that. So that's the origin story. And so I believe that a brand's narrative is a combination of both of those things. It's like your authentic purpose, which is your origin story. This is not a fake corporate purpose created from corporate terms, right? Like that's just one of the dangers of like trying to think, oh, we don't have a purpose. What's our purpose, right? Like, you've got a purpose. Just talk to the founder who founded it and why they founded it. Or start with, what is the problem you're solving for your customers? That's the purpose you're serving in the marketplace. There, you're welcome. So it's talking about that origin story, which is your authentic purpose, and then also reflecting back your marketplace story, which is the story that the customers talk or say about you in the marketplace. That is the big macro story. So you're telling that in tandem with micro stories, and micro stories are just pieces of content, right, that point back to the macro story. Think of them about like anecdotes, right? Anecdotal evidence of the demonstration of your brand's macro story, okay? So these are just like customer testimonials, just short stories about your impact being made. And eventually they just become just a series of smaller stories that are thematically reflective, or they thematically echo your macro story. You don't have to tell the same story every single time. It's just these stories have to be themed and they have to fall into the same theme. So if we look at Disney again, right? Like Disney has a catalog of films, but they also have a very defined brand image. So they're not going to have a rated R movie in their catalog, right? We're ignoring the fact that Disney bought Fox. That's why they bought Fox. So they could have R-rated content in their catalog under a separate brand identity, right? But the Disney brand is the family and children-friendly brand. You should feel safe about your children watching Disney films and watching Disney shows, right? Now, whether or not you actually feel safe about that, that's up to you. I'm just saying, like, that's the brand image that they're putting forth, is they are children-friendly, okay? So because of that, the content in their library and how they've constructed their library is for a very unique, it has similar themes around their entire film library. Okay, so you kind of start to know the type of flavor of film you're going to get when you watch Disney stuff. Same thing with how Marvel is starting to slowly form their own brand identity now within Disney, right? You start to know what you're going to get from a Marvel film. So this is what I mean by they're not all the same story, right? There's definite variations, but there's a limitation to the variations, and they serve the purpose of continuing to develop that brand identity by echoing the themes that you're expecting them to echo. So that is a very long-winded explanation of what brand storytelling is, and this is why I value brand storytelling. And ultimately, just to kind of like think about this really quickly, brand storytelling is simply using storytelling as a message strategy to build brand equity. And ultimately what that means is you're building a stronger relationship with your customer base, so that way you can increase the value of your product and offering and increase the impact you're having in within your community, the marketplace, or the greater society at large. Okay, hope this was super helpful for you. If you guys have any questions, you can find me at McNabb_storytelling on Instagram, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.